imagine passing your official examination to become a midwife and just 3 years later delivering the future King of France? Well, that's pretty much what happened to Louise Bourgeois, a royal midwife and a celebrated author of midwifery books, who described herself as the first woman practicing my art to take up the pen. Not to be confused with the 20th century artist Louise Bourgeois, though we'll talk a little bit about her too. So Louise Bourgeois, the midwife, had a meteoric career rise, and she ended up delivering all 6 children of the Queen of France, Marie de Medicis, including the future Louis XIII, besides around 2,000 other babies, and publishing several books. So, to learn more about this incredible woman, I spoke with someone who's an expert on her and her writings, and whose work I have followed for around a decade, I'd say, Dr. Alison Lingo, a historian of medicine based at the University of Berkeley in California. You'll notice that the image quality is not always the best, but that's Zoom for you. So, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and consider subscribing to the channel so you're notified when the new video is out. I also have a Patreon, and I would be very grateful if you considered supporting my work there too. Now, let's talk about midwifery. Hello, Dr. Lingo, and thank you so much for joining me today to chat about Louise Bourgeois. I thought we could maybe begin by briefly introducing her. And I know she was an educated woman and her husband was a surgeon, but I was also wondering about how she became a midwife, because she was a wet nurse before that, I think, right? And I thought we could just begin by setting the scene, because you mentioned in your writing that she had quite a peaceful life before the religious wars. And right. And this is the quote you sent me that I found really interesting. So she wrote, "Everyone was so happy here, and not for anything would we have traded our house for a beautiful one in the city, because the Saint-Germain suburb, among others, was full of princes and princesses, lords and ladies, as well as merchants and good artisans. We had everything that those who lived in the city had, plus good air and the freedom of beautiful places to walk. And when the troubles came, we paid a heavy price for what we had, especially on All Saints' Day." So can you tell us a little bit about her life and what happened on this fateful day?
Well, she was born what we might call today a middle-class girl, the daughter of a propertied man, and probably had a humanist education, because we know she could read and write, or we're sure she could read and most likely could write. And she lived that life until 1572, when the religious wars came to Paris. And as a result, with her husband at the front and her house destroyed by soldiers who were routing, she fled inside the city gates, the gate de Bourcier, to protect herself and her 4 children and her mother, and took what little she could manage to carry into the city, and earned a bit of money doing needlework and teaching needlework to young girls in her neighborhood for free.
The barricades went up in the city. When the last nights had left, 15,000 livres worth of houses were destroyed. My father had had them built on the trench at the Bourcier gate, and they had been there for only 5 years. We had no possessions except what little we had brought with us, which we lived off by selling them bit by bit every day. To earn something while keeping myself occupied, I began to do different kinds of needlework, which I knew how to do for no charge.
But I think it wasn't enough, even when her husband came back from the wars. So at that point, net femme, which in those days meant her midwife, suggested, "Louise, you know how to read and write. Your husband is a surgeon." And at that point, Bourgeois thought twice about becoming a midwife. Why? Because it was kind of a dirty business. It was not comparable to her middle-class property status. And there were responsibilities attached to being a midwife as well that might have impeded her decision. But ultimately, she said, rather than starve, she decided to become a midwife. And she plunged into the writings of Ambroise Paré, the royal surgeon, who had written an encyclopedia-like amount on surgery, and a special section in one of his books on surgery, and most particularly on podalic version, which had been lost over the Middle Ages by the West, and he reintroduced it.
A respectable woman who had delivered me of my 3 children and who liked me persuaded me to learn how to be a midwife. She said that if she had known how to read and write like me, she would have done great things, that her heart told her that if I undertook to learn midwifery, I would be the first of my estate in no time, that for 20 years my husband had been part of the household of the late Master Ambroise Paré, first surgeon to the king, and that he could teach me a great deal. I could not bring myself to do it when I thought of the responsibility of taking children to be baptized. In the end, the fear of seeing my children go hungry made me do it.
We know she did some wet nursing because she puts it up when she describes the licensing ceremony that she went through, when she claimed she lost a baby that she'd been nursing. It wasn't that complicated. You had to present yourself at the Châtelet before 2 sworn midwives, 2 surgeons, and a physician. And you had to swear to your morality and probity. What happened in very dramatic ways was Madame Dupuy, that one of the 2 sworn midwives at the Châtelet, questioned her and challenged her and asked her why indeed she wanted to be midwife when she didn't have to work because her husband was a surgeon.
By God, my friend, my heart tells me this doesn't bode well for us. Since she's a surgeon's wife, she'll be in league with these physicians. They'll be like purse cutters at the fair. We should only accept artisans' wives who don't understand anything about our affairs. She told me that my husband ought to provide for me without my doing anything, and that if I did otherwise, I should be burnt at the stake in order to set an example for others. They kept at me for such a long time and said so many stupid things that a lovely child whom I was wet nursing died from the vexation that the Dupuy woman in particular caused me. I say this to show that God knows how to avenge those who are harmed when they least expect it. So it will be said of her, since everyone else accepted me as a midwife, she was forced to accept me, to her great regret.
So you think the examination, the whole process she underwent, and the beginning of her career is indicative of how competitive the medical marketplace was at the time in Paris in particular?
I think mainly in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
At the countryside, I think it was all midwives, except unless there was a very wealthy aristocrat.
And I wonder about, because we can tell that she was very ambitious and she had quite a meteoric career rise. Everything happened so quickly for her. And so I know she became the royal midwife to Queen Marie de Medicis. And I was just wondering about how the clients had a role in recommending her, and how the whole the female networks worked in her favor, and just how quickly she became sort of the famous midwife.
The whole city talked of nothing but the queen's pregnancy, and of the fact that the king was giving her Madame Dupuy for a midwife. Madame Dupuy had served Madame la Duchesse, which was hardly agreeable to the queen. But it never entered my mind to think of being the queen's midwife, except that I believed the woman who had this honor would be very fortunate. I thought of the harm Madame Dupuy had done to me, and in truth, I would have wanted any other woman than her.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this sort of very quick career rise that she had.
I think her encounter with Madame Dupuy at her licensing examination was critical to her rise, because Dupuy was also royal midwife in the court of Henry IV. Mm-hmm. After his marriage to Queen Margot was annulled because she was barren, he married Marie de Medicis. Right after, in fact, the death of of Gabrielle d'Estrées, his mistress. And Dupuy had been Gabrielle d'Estrées' midwife.
Yeah.
And even though in her hands his beloved mistress died, he wanted her, Dupuy, to maintain her position as royal midwife. But Marie de Medicis was Italian, and Dupuy was aging, and she really didn't like her. She was, as Bourgeois describes her at the licensing examination, cranky and difficult woman. And so the word got out that Marie de Medicis was pregnant and that she didn't much like the royal midwife, who was Bourgeois' rival. And Bourgeois is an ascending star, in the constellation of midwives and midwife, midwife surgeons, male midwives.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, Bourgeois hatches a vast networking scheme among not only physicians, not only former clients, but also royal physicians, one of whose daughter she had successfully delivered.
Mm-hmm.
But the key moment was when Bourgeois was told by a lady in waiting, we think, that there was going to be a big banquet. I don't know exactly how she got in, but we imagine it to be this huge banquet with hundreds of people. And she was tipped off by one of the women in her network to be present. Now, there was a whole etiquette around what even her ladies in waiting could say to her when she was pregnant. But in spite of all those, intricacies of etiquette, court etiquette, one of her ladies in waitings pointed Bourgeois out to her and as a midwife. And as a result, Marie de Medici said, I want no one but her to touch me.
Oh, wow. That must have been quite
Yes. Which was then, at least as Bourgeois tells the story. And we have to remember that Bourgeois was an incredible storyteller. Her volumes are filled with dramatic case histories that I think could even be performed.
Mm-hmm.
The way she scenes, the way in which she becomes the hero as, the parturient is about to expire and she comes in and has her magic and pulls the baby out and all is well. And without her, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah. So we've been talking about how successful she was becoming and her sort of meteoric rise. And I remember you mentioned how she used that to sort of advance her family's position and create a medical dynasty of sorts. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that, about her, especially her children.
Certainly. Well, after she received her compensation for birthing Louis XIII and his 5 siblings, she was able to buy property on Paris's left bank. So being able to enjoy the status she had before the wars of being propertied and well-to-do. And in the same way, she helped her daughter Françoise marry one René Chartier, who became physician in ordinary and royal office holder in the court, and got a pension and appointment as physician to Henry IV's 2 daughters as well. And then their son, her daughter's son, and Bourgeois' grandson became physician in ordinary to Louis XIII. And then she had another daughter, Marie, who married Arnauld de la Seigne, who became secretary in the Chambre du Roi. And she had 2 sons. One became officer to the king's brother and later secretary to the queen, and the other became an apothecary. So as she sees it, the whole, her family encompassed the whole medical hierarchy. And with that, she implied that they shared knowledge and spread it near and far.
And speaking of which, so I wanted to ask you precisely about that, because I imagine that the success that she had as a royal midwife, like as a midwife in the royal birthing chamber, that must have tied directly into her becoming an author in the first place, right? Can you give us an idea of what her books were about?
A school that teaches everyone the admirable effects of the divinity of medicine married to the midwife's industriousness. From this school derive recipes that have had excellent results, and they follow out into the world only to help those who have not the money or the opportunity to consult a physician.
Because she wrote that she was the first woman, right, to write a midwifery manual that would have been published. So what can you tell us about her writing?
She saw her book as a school that would teach women above all, but also she spoke to surgeons and doctors that they too must understand a woman's body. That meant to know female anatomy, which was a rising science at the time with Vesalius's De Fabrica coming out in 1543.
Mm-hmm.
And the work of Ambroise Paré, which she read, also goes into detail about female anatomy. And she was lucky enough, part of her training, I'd say, not only had she had a humanist education, which you can see woven through, especially the poems in the beginning of the book that thank all of her supporters, but also in some of her stories and in the frontispiece of the book. But she also had read the Greek authors, I think, via Ambroise Paré, who was a great synthesizer of the ancient heritage. And so, along with that heritage and the rise of anatomy, and her connection to the Hôtel Dieu, which was the poor hospital in Paris. She was able to witness post-mortem dissections of women who'd given birth and died in childbirth.
That changes everything when you're writing a midwifery book.
Right. And she begged the physicians of Paris to teach other midwives female anatomy. And many of her case histories and descriptions point out the incompetence and ignorance of not only midwives, but surgeons concerning female anatomy and the difference between a placenta and a uterus and where it was in the body and how to tell.
But it's frightening when you think about it. You know, as someone giving birth, you really want the people who are helping you to know the difference between a uterus and a placenta.
Exactly. And not to pull out either.
The worst is when the child is positioned in such a way that the navel string is first, with the stomach towards the neck of the womb, with the arms and legs behind. This is a type of birth where few children survive, unless they are small and the mother's body is large. If they are large and if the mother's body is small, it is difficult to use one's hand in order to turn the child around. I will say that in all these difficult births, what must be done, if it can be done, is to put the navel string back in the mother's body as quickly as possible. However, if the midwife is not there when the water breaks, there is a danger that the child will already be dead when she arrives, because once the navel string is exposed to the air, it quickly cools and hardens.
So that was one of her missions. You know, her mission included female anatomy, learning, describing, and disseminating recipes or remedies for women both during pregnancy, during birth, in the postpartum period. She actually shared, I think she lived in what we might call a duplex with a physician who wrote self-help manuals saying where to buy herbs, recipes, and all of that. With that inspiration, I would guess, in her own inclination, as well as most women's inclination to have small gardens and make their herbal recipes because going to a pharmacist was more expensive. The book is riddled with all kinds of recipes for every kind of problem a woman might have. And in that domain, she experimented on herself as well. Describes it in her recipe for sore nipples.
That's so interesting, and it's something that we've spoken about before. Just comparing her to sort of like second wave feminists in the 70s and 80s with our bodies ourselves, and today we could compare her to Dr. Jen Gunter's and her work with the Vagina Bible and menopause and all of that. And I think it's so interesting that it's always important to teach women about their own bodies, but also to teach those who are helping them, treating them, how the body works, basically, right? And I know that the books that she wrote, they were financed by the Queen herself, weren't they?
Definitely.
So clearly the Queen supported that mission, which is incredible.
It is. And, you know, the first volume came out in 1609, the second one in 1617, and the third volume, the shortest volume, came out in 1626. And I looked at each volume and summarized it for the introduction to this book.
Yeah.
Right.
The Bible. The Bible on Louise Bourgeois.
Right. That in the first volume, she has almost all praise for the physicians who were beginning, as Monica Green has shown us, even as early as the 14th century, in specializing in gynecology. And wanting to be expert in that because, as we know, physicians did not want to use their hands. They were the brains. They were like the pathologists today who study what's wrong with the body and then delegate the hands-on procedural part to surgeons and pharmacists. And what is shown in the first volume is her abiding respect for those physicians. And think about it. They helped her become royal midwife, which led to her ability to publish this book.
Yeah.
So in that way, the first volume reflects that, as well as her frustration with ignorant midwives and ignorant surgeons who were impinging on her territory. The surgeons were.
Yeah. But thinking of medical practitioners and competition and collaboration. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about a case in which this sort of rivalry with another practitioner might have happened with, a surgeon or something like that.
Right. Well, as background, I want to point out that at the time in 17th century Paris, surgeons were beginning to want to boost their practice by taking on women's normal births. Surgeons had always been called in when the fetus was malpresenting, because they could use tools that midwives often didn't have available to them. But Bourgeois was feeling the rub of surgeons who were trying to take over her elite practice on the 17th century left bank of Paris. And these men, some were as well trained as Bourgeois, and some were not at all. And she was very concerned as much about them as competitors as incompetent midwives. So in the case that I think you were referring to, she talks about an obvious competing surgeon who was, in this case, taking over a birth after the mother got very impatient with the situation that she was in and was walking around and felt very hot, even though she had all her clothes off, and didn't trust Bourgeois, and had this surgeon deliver a normal birth, I suppose a year or two before, when she had been pregnant before, and it was very safe delivery. So when she was having trouble with this second birth, she called him in, much to Bourgeois' chagrin. And he actually was not that well trained as Bourgeois, and they lost the baby. So Bourgeois points this out in this rather tragic and dramatic case history, and blames the woman for not trusting her, and that the woman trusted an incompetent man midwife, as they were called then. So she said, this is how, after the baby died, this is how they value their stubbornness, those women who do not want to believe what they are told. I could have delivered her the same night as the day I once sent for, if she had wanted. This will serve as an example to others. And then she pats herself on the back to her readers by saying, by the way, I would add that I had the honor to deliver the queen of all her children, and I was never contradicted by the king, by her, by the physicians, or the ladies in waiting. I have delivered several princes and ladies without being contradicted. I have found this kind of behavior only in women of weak understanding and complete lack of judgment. So here, she holds
nothing back.
No, that's a very good point. She holds nothing back, nothing at all. And in this case, even when the second surgeon was called in, Bourgeois reported that it was too late, that he would indeed deliver the woman of her child, but that she would die from it. This is what happened that evening. So, woman and child died. Very tragically.
But it's interesting because it does illustrate, in all this talk about authority and expertise and midwives and men midwives and all this debate about who should, be the one delivering babies, who knows more or who knows best, is a sort of, it's relevant, of course, but at the end of the day, who decides is usually, like you said before, it's the family. It's often the woman giving birth. And if this woman trusted the surgeon more than Bourgeois, and maybe it was a mistake on her part, but I think when you are giving birth and you are that vulnerable, it's so important to trust your practitioner. And in most of Bourgeois' stories, you get the feeling that her clients really do trust her. And yes. I think she's really taken aback here that, like, why doesn't this woman trust me? And, it's sad and it's a shame, but I don't know. She does sound very judgmental of this. It's not maybe the best example of her being particularly kind and understanding. I don't know what you feel.
Well, she just felt really badly that the woman trusted this incompetent surgeon. The second volume, she's even more outspoken about incompetent surgeons. And one of her most horrifying case histories involves a surgeon, a husband, who was worried about his wife. The midwives were taking care of her. And then they decided, because, as we've been saying, surgeons were on the rise in this period in early 17th century Paris. And so when the wife, seemingly to the husband, seemed to be failing during labor, he called in a surgeon. And actually, the baby was about to crown and everything was all right. And he pushed the midwives away and had a successful delivery. And said to the surgeon, I want you for the second child. Well, this was a more complicated delivery. The surgeon wasn't really prepared. And he ended up, the presentation was difficult. The head was not coming out first. He didn't know podalic version, and all he knew was to use his tools. And he ends up scraping the baby out and cutting it up.
Oh my gosh.
Both the baby and the mom die.
Oh,
So this is what Bourgeois was horrified by, including the use of instruments. That's the second volume. By the third volume, she has it in for the physicians. She's sick and tired of their ignorance, even about pregnancy. And one of her first, I think there's only 3 case histories in the third volume. And in it, the first one describes a woman who's clearly pregnant, and the physician missed all the signs. And the woman languished. And at this time, she was a court midwife, and I think the doctors and surgeons who were royal surgeons and midwives within the court, royal surgeons and physicians within the court, were becoming increasingly jealous of her.
Yeah.
And so she brings that up subtly in the case history, not naming a physician who was not very good at his job. You're beginning to see her work dovetailing with the rising empiricism of the century. And that's where her self-help remedies and emphasis on anatomy and just hands-on knowledge and training comes to the fore.
Of course, it's always sad. It's disheartening to read stories like these, because we know that in so many of these situations, the women and the babies could so easily have been saved. And yet at the same time, and we've spoken about this already other times as well, but there is this myth, this stereotype that persists about midwives being ignorant, and it's of course it depends on time and place, and we can't generalize, and there's class, and there's all kinds of midwives. They're not a monolith. But with someone like Louise Bourgeois, I think we get a glimpse at how technically, how skilled, how qualified someone like her was.
The woman must be laid across a bed, the head and the lower back quite low, in order to bring the child back into position. Then, once the midwife has rubbed her hands with fresh butter, she should look for a way to find the feet and bring them down. Then have the woman lie on the side where you have brought the feet. Then support her lower back, and if she has a contraction, pull the child gently. If she does not have contractions, have her push. And while she does this, little by little, bring the child down and give the mother some rest, that she may regain her strength. Even give her some wine and some confection of alchemis in order to give her strength and courage to endure this strenuous labor, which is the worst.
And so speaking about childbirth complications, and you mentioned the podalic version before, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how she dealt personally with complications like that.
She had something like 8 protocols for malpresentations, shoulder dystocia, umbilical prolapse, things like that. And all of them involved manual manipulations of the baby. And in that way, she stood out in contrast to, say, Jacques Guillemot, whose book on childbirth came out in 1609, the same year her first volume appeared. And whereas he, in many cases, being a surgeon with tools, would have used his tools, she would have used her hands. The issues around malpractice and reputation that led most midwives to refrain from using tools and engaging in difficult deliveries. And if you go back to licensing, that only began in Paris in 1560, was the first secular regulation of midwives. Until then, it was a very informal system. And not all midwives in Paris went through licensing. So, but if you did, you swore that if you had a complicated delivery, you would call for a surgeon or a senior midwife, which to me was a kind of loophole that allowed midwives, if they had tools, to use them. Now, Bourgeois, at least in her writing, only claims to have used a tool to remove a kidney stone, and she borrowed her husband's tool to do it. And some scholars see that as a sign that she was pro-instrument. But I think she wasn't, because of the dangers around it in terms of reputation that it entailed for a midwife. Because they were, as you said, and as doctors and surgeons increasingly saw childbirth as a territory to control, if not to completely, and to manage, if not to engage in directly. The issues around difficult births became more and more problematic for midwives.
Definitely. Yeah.
And because because as much as she called for the doctors in 1609 to teach anatomy, it wasn't until 1750 that they actually did.
Yeah.
In Paris. And the only place women could learn anatomy and have highly skilled midwives teach them was at the Hotel Dieu.
Mm-hmm.
And they only took 3 or so midwives, apprentices, every 3 months to do so. So it's a very small number. Not so much medicalization was occurring at this time in the sense of a biomedical perspective, or even one that maybe Ambroise Paré would support, but masculinization of childbirth. And just like today, the educated classes learned about this. It is they who preferred these surgeons.
Mm-hmm.
But as you were saying, there were highly educated and experienced and skilled midwives like Bourgeois, including, I'm sure, Madame Dupuy, Madame Perron, who was another sworn surgeon, sworn midwife at the Châtelet, who could perform the same kinds of maneuvers that Bourgeois could.
And I think it's important whenever we're talking about medicalization or masculinization of childbirth, it's hard to, but it's important to avoid like dichotomies, I think, like two binaries in terms of like midwives only being associated only with the empirical practical knowledge, and physicians and surgeons with theory and the world of universities, because we know it didn't work like that. We know there was lots of overlap. And I think Bourgeois, even though she wasn't an average midwife by any means, we know she was someone who was exceptional. She shows us that things are more, there should be more nuance in discussing things like that. And I think that applies to how we think about childbirth today as well. But I do love reading her writing. I love how opinionated she is. You can really tell. And like you mentioned with the way she spoke about other medical professionals throughout the different volumes, how her perspectives are changing as she is progressing in her career, as she's maybe becoming more confident and not someone who's just starting out anymore.
I would say she's a pioneer in campaigning for women's health, in particular reproductive health, and to spread knowledge of the body and how it works. And ironically, her understanding of science in her day was based on a humoral model of the body that she got from reading Paré, who had read the ancients.
Mm-hmm. Because reading her, I get the feeling that, like you said, she was someone who was seems to have been, when she was attending someone, very calm and in control of the situation, sort of favoring a sort of non-interventionist style. At least in her, that's the feeling I get from reading her. So do you think there are any lessons that we can sort of learn from her in terms of how we can think and understand childbirth today?
Definitely. She believed in letting nature take its course, and only if it hesitated or the woman's body did not respond to nature, to the dynamic process of birth, does one intervene, and very gently, and with the gentlest of herbs and physical interventions. And that was her true belief. And when we look at not just the masculinization of childbirth, which began in her day, but the medicalization of childbirth that we're confronted by today, we're really challenged to return to the kind of birthing that Bourgeois would have advocated. So we need to combine her more physiological, natural approach to childbirth with the biomedical, surgical one.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of her legacy as a feminist icon, as someone who advocated for gentleness and letting nature take its course, I was thinking, because that's another topic that is so interesting about. There's so much to say and so much that can be said about Louise Bourgeois. But I was thinking about the other Louise Bourgeois, the artist, and
Right.
how and the connection between the two of them. And this could be a video and a chat in itself, but just because it might be interesting for people to go and look it up. What do you think of this sort of, it's not an appropriation, I guess, but is this like rereading, reinterpretation of Louise Bourgeois, the midwife, by Louise Bourgeois, the artist, and the feminism that connects them both? What can you tell us about that?
Referring to the frontispiece or the cover to her collection of secrets, recueil de secrets, that the 20th century Louise Bourgeois did, where it shows, a body floating, inside a uterus and all of that. And also, I think 20th century Bourgeois saw the 17th century bourgeois struggling with women in their bodies and the violence against them, but also describing male abuse, where women, both by surgeons, so a kind of violence in the birthing room, as well as a husband being violent towards a wife. And 20th century bourgeois pieces, whether the paintings or the sculpture or the what do you call those rooms that she created?
Installations, yeah.
Installations imply violence against women. And I think she clearly read 17th century bourgeois and saw her descriptions of these instances of violence, whether from within the female body itself, with the wandering womb, which was another term for suffocation of the mother, which Freud then transposed into hysteria, or actual external violence against women, which also continues today in many birthing rooms or hospitals against women. And in that way, I see a real continuity, unfortunately, between the violence that women experienced in 17th century and the violence that women experience today, and how both author and artist are in dialogue with each other across the centuries concerning that very problem that seems to be with us.
Yeah. But I do like that for both of them. I think things are so raw, and yet at the same time, there's this they're hopeful, I think. And with Bourgeois, the 17th century Bourgeois, the midwife, as you mentioned, her writing in terms of trying to help women, it's instructing midwives, but it's also instructing lay women, regular average women themselves on how to manage their own health. And I think that's such a feminist, it's such an empowering, just such a cool thing to do. So yeah, so I think that's no wonder why, she's considered such an icon.
She was, a precursor to those first, second wave feminists who said, learn about your body. Our bodies, ourselves. Said to women in one passage from her book, know yourself, your own constitution. In French, it's naturel. Meant your humoral physiology, whether you were sanguine or phlegmatic or whatever it was. In this case, and it was in the first volume, where she was very much trying to win over physicians and respected them, so that you can tell your physician what your constitution is, so they know what to prescribe.
Yeah.
And in the same way, today, when you see a doctor, you need to be informed about your own body and what you need, given how few minutes you have before them anyway, not to do with medical care such as it is. And so, you find her trying to reach as wide an audience as possible, knowing again, and we haven't pointed that out, how low female literacy rates were.
Yeah.
She even tackles that problem by implying it in some places, directly saying that this was read to a woman. Women read to each other. Those who couldn't read read to those.
Yeah. I think that's something we forget when we're thinking about women reading in the past, is how collective reading could be, how it was often a collective experience. It wasn't something that you were doing by yourself in a room silently. And so if you had one reader and you had a big family, everyone could potentially read the book.
And books were expensive to most women. So that anyone but the wealthiest bought these books is unlikely.
Yeah.
You have to really think about how transmission took place. It was
Yes.
word of mouth, or by Bourgeois herself. In her book, in a way, is a compilation of what she probably said to other midwives and to her clients. And they, because that was the tradition and the way of spreading knowledge, they would spread that knowledge. So we have here a written testimony to her knowledge and what she taught at her school.
Yeah, like you mentioned, I think her writing style is so vivid. She's so direct, and I think especially because she's writing in first person, right? Because it's her stories. She was there. She was attending all these women.
I think she had a really good style and ability to write that way, but she wasn't alone. At the time, case histories were becoming a popular genre among Latinate doctors who wrote up their case histories as observaciones.
Mm-hmm.
If you recall, this book is called Diverse Observations, and it comes from that tradition.
So I was wondering about the real patients and clients that Louise Bourgeois saw, and I was wondering if there are any stories that you could share with me about any cases, any people she helped.
Of course, there's several that are most striking, I think, that could resonate with our audience today. I think one of them was about a woman who Bourgeois knew even before she had become a midwife, when she lived in the fancy suburb of Saint-Germain. Mm-hmm. And she talks about her having what I think we would now call postpartum depression and postpartum suicidal, desires, to the point that it scared her family to death. And this woman had had a series of stillbirths, and after each one, she ran around the town naked, or in her neighborhood, and jumped into a privy. And I think Bourgeois sees it as a problem related to her needing to nurse and the loss of the child. And it reflects a lot on what was known and not known at the time. How she writes about it is the other aspect that I wanted to bring out, that she really brings you right into the moment. So, for instance, she says, 6 days after giving birth, the woman lost her mind and became deranged for 4 years altogether after she had had the stillbirth. And she had friends and her husband watch over her. And in spite of that, Bourgeois goes on, she would go out in the streets naked without a shirt. She would walk straight into strangers' houses, which scared them. And I think, if I read in the New York Times something about a woman postpartum depression and psychosis, that's actually...
It does sound like it.
The contemporaries of Bourgeois only knew to try to contain the poor soul rather than look into her psyche, or they didn't know about hormones then, and saw this from, I'd say, almost behavioral point of view. Let's try to control and keep her quiet.
And safe, right? I mean,
safe, absolutely. But she had a series of stillbirths until finally, when Bourgeois became her midwife, she actually had a safe birth without a stillborn. But we know from our own period that women can have many stillbirths and still have safe and healthy children. But this woman, I think the fear itself led to her psychosis.
And so she threw herself inside the privy. Oh my God.
Right. And she did it a second time when she had another stillborn.
Oh.
And Bourgeois says, God preserved her, for some of her clothing got stuck on a piece of wood that had formerly served as the scaffolding in the privy. And she jumped in. Those who were watching her had thought that she was safe, and so they must have gone about their business. But when they came back to check in on her, she was gone. So they ran to the privy, knowing that's what she had done in the previous birth. And they went to the privy, and this is Bourgeois speaking, and found the seat had been taken off. Frightened, they sent for help to pull her out. She was found alive and unharmed, and she went on for 18 months without being quite recovered. And so that's how postpartum depression and psychosis were dealt with at the time.
But at the same time, I think it's interesting that even though, of course, they didn't know everything we know now about postpartum depression and psychosis, I think it's nice to think that the family and the community are really trying to help her and protect her in whichever way they can. And I mean, I think this is so interesting about this way of giving birth and having children, where the community is so involved in taking care of children and the mother. I think it's, without, I'm not like idealistic or saying that it was the best way or anything like that to give birth, but I do think that when the community helps, I think that makes a big difference. And I wonder if this poor woman, if she didn't have anyone to help her, how much worse it would have been.
I think those are very good points, and reminds me of all the problems we're having today because we've lost that neighborhood community support that was just natural and, automatic in the past. And it's wonderful that it was there, though I think Bourgeois would complain as well, because in some of her case histories, she talks about how the family was working against her, that she knew, you have with her the development of an expert, whether male or female, that knows better than the family.
So I was thinking in terms of remedies, and we talked about all the recipes that Bourgeois had for all kinds of things. And I was thinking about the other case we were talking about, and about the ways she tried treating the woman. And this was also a very complicated birth, wasn't it?
Yes. And the way she describes entering the birthing room and the odors, you just are right there. And she even gives the year in which this took place. And it also shows how she worked successfully with male medics and collaborated with them when she was working with this physician in this case. And she opens by saying, at the beginning of the year 1610, the medical doctor of this city asked me to come with him to see a woman said to have been in labor for 9 or 10 days. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, today there'd be a C-section, right? Going on.
That sounds horrific.
Yeah. And who was more dead than alive as a result. Nevertheless, he very much wanted my opinion in order to have all the help he possibly could and to remain in the good opinion of those who had sent for him. So here you see that complex network of patient/client, husbands sometimes get involved, neighbors, mothers, mother-in-laws, and the birth attendant. And this physician wanted to stay in good stead of all of them, as does Bourgeois. But I think you're right. At times, her high opinion of herself leads her to criticize anyone who disagrees with her. What worried him more was that it might be too late to save her. We arrived and found a woman who seemed at death's door. She was pale, her eyes wide open and staring straight ahead, her nose shrunken and her breath funereal. And here you see Bourgeois under the influence of Ambroise Paré, who she read, because he describes what it looks like when a woman might be dying in childbirth. And these are all signs of imminent death. Mm-hmm. She could keep nothing down without vomiting it up immediately. In an hour, she had drunk 2 pints of water, which really I think amounts to about 2 gallons in our terms and liters, that would be about 4 or 5 liters of water. Near her bed was a flood of her vomit. The hearth fire could not heat up water quickly enough, and so she was drinking cold water, often with an egg yolk, which she would vomit up this very hour. She had no contractions, but when I found the womb open, which I think she means the cervix.
Yeah, I think so.
Anatomy was described in sort of what we would see as general terms.
Yeah.
It was only just being, just women were only being cadavers dissected at this time, and female anatomy being very much more detailed in its description. And I knew well she had been in labor, but that nature was overcome. And in Bourgeois, nature is an entity and a dynamic in and all of itself that she believed in working with. And here she says, nature was overcome, and since it had not been helped along, the child had gone back in the upper part of the womb and made the mother feel as if she was going to suffocate and provoke the excessive vomiting. And she gives the woman a clister, which is a remedy for that, and had helped bring the child down. So here she's using that with rhubarb water, which she's sold ready-made here.
I thought this was such an interesting detail because we're used to thinking of all these people, and especially women, making remedies at home. And of course they did that. But you could also buy so many things ready-made from apothecaries, from other women who make extra to sell. And it gives you an idea of what was available to them, right?
Right. Well, there were herbs available that they could pick up at the apothecary shop as well. She talks about. So, in fact, she lived in the home in the same building, so to speak, with a doctor who wrote up, I think Guyon, who wrote up a list of remedies for women. Mm-hmm. Could easily buy. He said close to where they lived, and he gave lists of where in Paris you could buy some of these remedies. And it was a way to sort of step over the doctors who were prescribing and do it yourself, a kind of our bodies ourselves approach.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Or Jen Gunter approach.
Yeah.
Know what you're doing, know your body, know yourself, and take care of yourself. That's cheaper and perhaps safer than counting on experts.
Yeah. And so what happened to the woman, the one giving birth? Do we know?
Yes, she survived. She survived. So
that's wonderful. Well, this is so fascinating. Thank you so much for, for talking to me, for answering all my questions. I could spend like hours asking you other questions about her, but yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat and to tell us all about this incredible woman, and I learned a lot. So thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.